My name is Tracey Elizabeth Carrillo Fecher. I identify as a white Latina woman. This is an identity I've embraced only in the last decade. My father fled Cuba during the revolution in 1959 and only returned once to his country in his 70s before he died. This means that I'm a first-generation Cuban. I don't look Latina. So when I was younger, and sometimes still today, I've not felt like I deserve to identify as a Latina. What changed my feelings on this? First, being Cuban is part of who I am. My maiden name is Carrillo. I did not realize that giving up my maiden name when I got married would cause me pain until I actually went to make the changes. In Cuban culture, I would have been known as Tracey Elizabeth Carrillo de Young. Young is my mother's maiden name, and I would not have changed my name to my husband's. I absolutely love that Cuban women keep their mother's identity. As a compromise with my new husband, I took Carrillo as my legal middle name. I would never change my name again. Race is personal, related to our lived experiences. I did not feel like I deserved to call myself Latina because I don't look like my friends who are Mexican. I don't look like my sister-in-law who has 2 Cuban parents. I look like my mother. It is likely that my appearance has given me advantages, but there are hidden foundational things that I had to deal with from my family of origin. I am a strong, opinionated female who grew up with a father who believed that good girls were chaperoned on dates by a reliable tia or abuela. I have 3 brothers who did not face the same machismo barriers that I had to navigate as a teenager. You never know what a person's lived experience is and how their family culture affects them. When I was an impressionable teen and young adult, race was not discussed in the communities I was a part of. Not at home, not at school, not at work, not even that much at church. These days, as a woman in my 50s, I have found myself deeply saddened by the news and not sure what steps I could personally take to make a difference for the serious race issues that face our country. Recently, an opportunity has come up, and I find myself inspired by someone younger that I work with. He's introduced me to the topic of intersectionality and how we serve low-income individuals who have Medi-Cal at Sonrisa's Dental Health. We have a wait list for low-income adults to get care. Adults with Medi-Cal in San Mateo County can go and have an infected tooth pulled Monday through Friday mornings between 8 and 9 at any county dental clinic. But they have to wait 4+ years to get their teeth cleaned or to get that cavity filled so that it doesn't lead to that infection. Our board and our management team are having discussions about if a Black man should get off of the wait list before a white man. To be on Medi-Cal, if you work full-time, it means you make less than $23 an hour. So we know that neither the white man or the Black man is making a living wage in San Mateo County. It's a delicate conversation because we all bring our lived experience, politics, and beliefs into the mix. Our team is committed to having the discussion, first at a philosophical level, because how you operationalize intersectionality for an already challenged population would take a lot of study and care. I'm grateful we're having the discussion, and I trust that we'll navigate it thoughtfully. It's really clear to me that there's not an answer that will make everyone happy. But that is the truth with anything hard and worth doing. Personally, I'm thankful I get to learn alongside these incredibly caring and thoughtful people. As a white Latina woman in her 50s, who's a born problem solver, this real life and important conversation gives me something meaty to continue exploring the meaning of my own culture and race identity while serving the neighbors in the community that I live in.
History is a funny thing. Perhaps funny is the wrong word. Strange is probably a better word. And we tend to think of history as something that's fixed. That, well, we've got all the facts of the past and we just need to read them and we know what happened. And I think we know now that that's not true. There's many perspectives in history, there's many interpretations of history. And yes, history is often written by the victors. As someone with a British identity, I know our colonial history, and the stories I heard growing up are a little different of British colonial history than I hear now. And I think we're probably closer to the truth, but we're probably not quite there yet, because so often the voices of those most marginalized, the voices of those oppressed, are seldom heard. And there's a real fine line between history and myth. And we all have myths we tell about ourselves. We've got myths about the discovery of the Americas. There was 10 million people living here in the Americas when it was discovered. And of course, there's the myths of Thanksgiving. And I believe Hansu will be talking a little bit about that next Sunday, so I won't go there. But the myths of the founding fathers, where all men were created equal. That leaves out half the population, and only certain men were included in that. So we're realizing that, history is complicated, and we're learning more about the past now. And that's a good thing. And of course, there's slavery, the Civil War, civil rights. And of course, racism ended with civil rights. I'm glad you laughed. Because I think it's so apparent. We see with the verdict this week in Wisconsin that a white teenager gets off with killing 2 people, and then in Texas, there's a woman serving a life sentence for killing her abuser. It's complicated. And of course, the woman was African American. And we know our justice system's not fair. We see it. The Black Lives Matter movement was a response to the continuing injustice that so many people of color suffer in our justice system. And we all have myths that we tell about ourselves. We have the myths we tell about our country. We have the myths we tell about a religious community. We have the myths that we tell about a religious denomination. We have the myths we tell about ourselves. And as a religious leader, I believe in myths. I believe that myths can contain a more important truth than facts can. But we always need to be questioning those myths, and that's why this service is about accountability in our history, especially the history as regards to race relations in this country. In 1984, in the 40th anniversary of the Second World War, Richard von Weizsäcker, who was a West German Prime President at the time, said that, and this was in a speech he gave at the 40th anniversary of the Second World War, said, "Anyone who closes his eyes to the past is blind to the present. Whoever refuses to remember the inhumanity is prone to risk a new infection." Realizing he was a West German president 40 years after the Second World War, and he was referring to the Holocaust and the tragedy of that. And for us, it's not a new infection. It's an infection. The infection of racism has been with this country before its founding, and it's present with us today. I want to do a word association with you. History, social justice, accountability, oppression, woke, anti-racism, intersectionality, critical race theory. What do you think when you hear of critical race theory? It's been getting a lot of publicity recently, and mainly negatively. At the recent Virginia governor's election, I saw an interview, some of you may have seen it, on television, and they were interviewing this man, said, "What's the most important issue in this election for governor in Virginia?" And the man said, "Critical race theory." And the interviewer said, "And what is it?" And it was kind of embarrassing because the man didn't know. He couldn't answer that question. But it was the most important reason for his voting. It could be easy to laugh at that man, but that is really sad. It's something, that man had been so influenced by the media, by politicians, by sophisticated advertising, that an issue he did not understand became the most important reason he voted. I wasn't angry, I was just sad at looking at that. And we see it at school board meetings throughout the country where there's antagonism and violence, and we don't want the children indoctrinated with critical race theory. How many people know what critical race theory is? I didn't really know until I started preparing for this service, and I've been using it for about 10 years. So I'm not that much better than that man who voted. And Patricia Williams is a professor of law and philosophy. She wrote in The Nation magazine in October, 8 states have passed anti-critical race theory laws, and around 20 more have bills pending, with common language from a common source, which bars mandatory gender and sexual diversity training, banning any belief that America is inherently racist or sexist, whether consciously or unconsciously. Nearly all versions prohibit teaching in which any individual should feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress on account of his or her race or sex. Those are the words of Patricia Williams. If you're really worried about people's discomfort, guilt, anguish, then you can't teach them history. History is tragic. There's so much suffering, there's so much hurt, there's so much violence, there's so much discrimination, there's so much oppression. And I call the words of Richard von Weizsäcker, the German West President, we can't ignore history, but we need to know the truth about history. We need to know the pain, we need to know the struggles, and we need to hear the voices of those most marginalized. So what is critical race theory? And how can it be helpful in this area? I first heard of critical race theory, or I was told by a congregant in my previous congregation about 4 or 5 years ago. He said, he accused me of believing in the CRT dogma. And I'm going, CRT, what's he talking about cathode ray tubes for? Old television sets? I honestly didn't know what he meant, so I had to ask him. And he explained, well, it's critical race theory. And so when we explored it, and I realized I have been influenced by critical race theory. Our anti-racist, anti-oppressive, multicultural training that we get in Unitarian Universalism, the classes we do, are rooted in critical race theory. And I'm here to say that's a great thing. Critical race theory has opened my eyes to injustice in a way that I would not have been able to experience in other ways. And Christopher M. Fleming wrote that critical race theory is an interdisciplinary body of scholarship that emerged in the aftermath of the civil rights movement. As legal theorist, it grew up in law schools in the 1970s, grappled with naming and challenging the persistence of racism after the fall of legally allowed segregation. Critical race theory boldly embraced an overtly activist agenda, the promotion of racial justice and the eradication of racial oppression. Bridging legal analysis with storytelling that centers the experiences of people of color, critical race theory is set about to unveil and address the persistence of racism and white dominance. She goes on to say, and more importantly, scholars in this tradition also acknowledge the intersections of racism with sexism, class oppression, and other terms of inequality. One of the most helpful features of critical race theory is its clear analysis of white supremacy in the so-called post-civil rights era, a period of US history when politicians and the majority population increasingly portrayed themselves as beyond race. or non-racist. Those are the words of Crystal Fleming. Some of you might be familiar because she wrote those words in the 2019 issue of UU World. So if you've got that at home, I encourage you to go back and read that article. What critical race theory was trying to address, it acknowledged that yes, the civil rights movement was able to change laws, but our culture was still racist, and the law was not neutral in the eyes of many people of color. So we changed the law, but our culture didn't change because it was still human beings had been enculturated with racism, with white supremacy culture for years and centuries. Therefore, changing the law was not enough. And I think culture change is what religious community is about. And that's why anti-racist, anti-oppressive work is a religious issue, because it's culture change work. And we are called to do that as Unitarian Universalists. But the negativity and the reaction against critical race theory has been harsh. And one of the main people credited behind when President Trump in September 2020, he basically had an executive order which he said no teaching or training, diversity training, no teaching of critical race theory can happen in the federal government. The person credited with that is an analyst at the Manhattan Institute, which is a right-wing think tank, and Christopher Rufo is his name. And he actually has said this in a tweet last March. He said that its goal was to run a public persuasion campaign that would conflate any number of topics and deposit them into a new bucket called critical race theory. And this is a quote from him: "We have successfully frozen the brand critical race theory into public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic as we put out all the various cultural insanities under the brand category. The goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think of critical race theory." So critical race theory has been deliberately undermined and misrepresented. And whether you agree with critical race theory or not, if we truly believe in our principles in the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, then we have to resist this lie. So why are they so against, this group so against critical race theory? Because it threatens to disrupt the power balance. Because if we really get the truth of history out there, if we really teach in our schools and in our colleges the truth of our history through critical race theory and listen to the voice of the marginalized, listen to the voices of the oppressed, then we will have a different perspective on our history. It will disrupt the power. And that systems of power have a way of preserving themselves. They've done it for hundreds of years, and they'll keep trying to do it unless we can resist it. And I want to talk about some of the themes of critical race theory so to give you an understanding, but I encourage you all to do your own reading and learn about it. Not the extent of agreeing or disagreeing, but understanding. And one of the basic tenets of critical race theory is that racism and disparate racial outcomes are the result of complex, changing, and often subtle social and institutional dynamics, rather than explicit and intentional prejudices of individuals. And that's really important, because we think of racism as, some Ku Klux Klan member or some alt-right extremist. And yes, those exist, but that's not the real problem that's disruptive of, in racism today. It's these systems, these institutions, these communities, including Unitarian Universalism, has got institutional dynamics that favor those of us with white skin over those of us with dark skin. And we heard from Tracey in our reflection where she talked about she had this Latina background, but she could pass as white, and that changed the dynamic. And that's a complex dynamic that I think she's probably still working on to this day. And But I really admire her opening up about this and how she kind of hid and ignored that identity for many years, up until the last 10 years. And that's what the system encourages us. It encourages us to be white, encourages us, those of us with marginalized identities, to push those to the side. And the other thing that's important to realize about race is it's a social construct. There's no biological basis for race. It's a social construct. And when we construct these social identities, it's often used to discriminate. It's been used to discriminate against women. It's used to discriminate against people of color. It's been used to discriminate against homosexuals and transgender folk. These are created because it's an identity that is perceived as best, and these other identities are seen as inferior. That's where the white supremacy comes in. And one of the things that I think critical race theory offers, it gives us this race-conscious approach to social transformation. Changing the law is not enough. You look at what happened with affirmative action. There was a race-conscious approach to transformation. We need to give those who have been struggling, those who have been marginalized historically, we need to give them a favorable outcome. Because equality of opportunity, which I used to strongly believe in until I really studied with critical race theory, is not enough. You need some equality of outcomes, and sometimes you need to enforce that. And it raises that question, because affirmative actions always existed. It used to exist for white men. And now it exists for people of color in some circumstances. And I think one of the other biggest things that critical race theory said, it really raised up the importance of storytelling. That hearing about the lived experiences of those who were marginalized was important and had validity and needed to be heard by a wider audience. And that's how it's changing history. And then there's many aspects to critical race theory, but the other one that Tracey lifted up was that intersectionality, that we have these complex identities. And we look at the history of feminism in the 1970s, and there was a real struggle that the feminist movement had of attracting women of color, particularly African-American women. And the reason was that African-American women identified first and foremost as black before they identified as women, because they felt more oppressed as black women than they did as women. They were more oppressed as black. And so that's been an instinct, and that's an intersectionality. When you realize when you've got multiple identities, people have different experiences of oppression, but have the experience of oppression. So why is this religious work? Because it's culture change, because our first principle is the inherent worth and dignity of all people. Our second principle is justice and equity and compassion in human relations. Fourth one I mentioned earlier, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. If something's not true and is resisting liberation for a large group of people, we need to address it. And then our sixth principle was the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. And we know we do not have justice for all in our current society. And we do put the love of all humanity at the center of our religion. That's what we are called to do by our universalist tradition. God's love extends to all humanity, no exceptions, and we are called to embody that love in our actions, in our words, and in our life. And institutional racism of all the forms of racism is the most important. We need to address institutional racism within our own local community, within the wider country. And Kamara Phyllis-Jones is a doctor and anti-racist activist, and she defines institutionalized racism as differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. Institutionalized racism is normative, sometimes legalized, and often manifests as inherited disadvantage. It is structural, having been absorbed into our institutions of custom, practice, and law. So there need not be an identifiable offender. Indeed, institutionalized racism is often evident as inaction in the face of need. Institutionalized racism is often evident as inaction in the face of need, manifesting itself both in material conditions and in access to power. With regard to the former, examples include differential access to quality education, sound housing, gainful employment, appropriate medical facilities, and a clean environment. Examples include differential access to quality education, sound housing, gainful employment, appropriate medical facilities, and a clean environment. Those are the words of Camera Phyllis Jones. And I read these words and I think of the work we do, and I think of the Share the Plate recipient today, who will now be asking the work we've done in the eviction moratorium, the work they've done in affordable housing, the work they've done to centre the voices of those most marginalised in our community, amplifying them, not speaking on behalf of them, but helping those voices be amplified. And that's what we can do as a religious community.